The March snowstorm had swallowed the highway whole when the Belgian Malinois collapsed into Zoe Tanner's headlights and refused to move. She was 11 kilometers west of Kenora on the Trans-Canada, her knuckles stiff from gripping the wheel through 4 hours of driving snow. 27 years old, a paramedic with the Northwestern Ontario Regional Health Authority, running on 40 minutes of sleep and 2 gas station coffees after a 16-hour shift that had included a cardiac arrest, a snowmobile trauma, and a 12-year-old with a broken arm who wouldn't stop crying for his mother. The last thing she needed was an obstacle on Highway 17 at 2:30 in the morning. She stamped the brakes. Her pickup fish-tailed across the center line before the winter tires caught and pulled her to a skidding stop. The dog was enormous, 80-odd pounds of muscle and matted fur lying across the yellow dividing line, snow piling silently against his flank. Zoe sat for 2 heartbeats with the wipers slapping back and forth, her coffee going cold in the cup holder, staring at the shape in her headlights. She grabbed her flashlight and got out. The cold hit her like a door, -19 with the wind chill, the kind of cold that lived in your back teeth. She crossed the 2 lanes of empty highway, boots punching through the frozen crust, and crouched down beside the animal. He was no ordinary dog. The beam of her flashlight swept across him and stopped. Strapped to his chest and shoulders was a heavy-duty tactical vest, matte black ballistic-grade Kevlar, fitted to his body with a precision that cost more than Zoe's truck. No civilian tags, no breed registry. Only a sequence of characters stamped into a metal strip on the right shoulder panel, K9T4, and above that, barely legible beneath a smear of blood and ice, Talon. The dog raised his head. His eyes caught the flashlight and held it. Pale gold, precise, exhausted, and entirely steady. He did not growl. He did not flinch. He watched her with an intelligence that had no business living in an animal's face, as if he was deciding whether she was worth trusting. Zoe's paramedic training took over before her fear could. She ran her gloved hands along his side and found the wound high on his right flank, just behind the edge of the vest panel. A gunshot wound, entry clean, exit ragged. High-velocity rifle, not buckshot. Blood had soaked through the tactical webbing and frozen into a dark crust in the snow beneath him. He'd lost a significant volume. He was still losing more. "Okay," she said aloud to herself as much as to him. "Okay, I've got you." He let her lift him. That was the part she would think about later. How he let her do it, how he bore the weight and the pain of being moved with absolute stoic discipline, his legs tucked and his breathing controlled, as though he understood that fighting her would cost him what little he had left. She was not a small woman, but he was a heavy dog, and getting him into the back of her Ranger took 3 attempts and a surge of adrenaline that left her arms shaking. She laid him across her emergency blanket, pressed a wadded trauma dressing against the wound, and drove the remaining 7 kilometers to her property, with one hand on the wheel and one reaching back to maintain pressure, bringing a wounded military K9 home instead of calling the police. It was the most natural thing in the world to do. It would also, she would later understand, nearly get her killed. Her grandmother's property sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off the highway into 300 acres of boreal forest, black spruce and white birch that closed around you like a curtain the moment you left the main road. The house was old but solid, squared timber construction built to last a century, and now well into its second. Zoe had inherited it 8 months ago. She'd meant to sell it. She hadn't sold it. She bypassed the house, where her younger sister Ruby was sleeping, 8 years old, curled up in the guest room, with the nightlight on, and the door left open the way she liked it, and drove straight around to the detached garage her grandmother had used as a woodworking shop. Under the fluorescent overheads, she went to work. She had supplies. Paramedics who worked remote posts kept supplies at home. It wasn't unusual. Local anesthetic, IV saline, a suture kit she'd requisitioned 6 weeks ago and never returned. She peeled back the tactical vest carefully, noting the weight of it, noting the sealed waterproof panel along the left breast lining. Something flat and hard behind the ballistic plate. Something she didn't open. She set the vest on the workbench. Then she looked at the vest again, specifically at the collar attachment, where a small rectangular module was clipped to a D-ring and blinking a slow, steady amber. A tracking device. Her hand found a crescent wrench on the pegboard behind her without her brain fully authorizing the decision. She brought it down on the module twice. The blinking stopped. She couldn't have explained why she did it. Instinct, maybe. The kind of instinct paramedics develop for when something is wrong in a way they can't yet name. The surgery took 90 minutes. The bullet had torn through the latissimus muscle and nicked a rib, but stopped short of the lung cavity. Zoe cleaned the channel with saline, closed the internal layers with absorbable sutures and sealed the outer wound with interrupted nylon. The dog, Talon, she was already thinking of him as Talon, lay on a doubled horse blanket through all of it, panting in shallow, controlled breaths, his pale gold eyes tracking her hands with a calm that should have been impossible for any animal under that level of pain. When she tied off the last suture and sat back on her heels, he let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, and he put his head on her knee. Just that, the weight of it solid and warm and deliberate. Zoe sat on the cold concrete floor of her grandmother's garage at 4 a.m, with a military working dog's head in her lap, and she felt something she hadn't expected, a ferocious, irrational protectiveness she had no business feeling for an animal she'd known for 2 hours. "Nobody is touching you again," she said quietly. It wasn't a promise she had any authority to make. She meant it anyway. She spent the rest of the night in the wooden shop chair beside him, her grandmother's old double barrel laid across her thighs, listening to the storm work itself out against the garage walls. Outside, the boreal forest was absolute darkness and wind, and the sound of nothing human at all. By 7 a.m, the storm had broken, and the world was white and perfectly still. Zoe woke with a jerk to a small voice, muffled by the closed garage door. "Zoe, the power's on, but there's no Wi-Fi and I can't find my book." "Ruby." Talon was already on his feet, or trying to be. He'd moved to the garage door, his injured side held slightly higher than the other, his ears pressed forward, his body angled between Zoe and whatever was on the other side. Not aggressive, positioned, like a soldier stepping in front of a civilian. "It's okay," Zoe told him. "It's my sister." She opened the door 4 inches, letting in a blade of cold March air and the face of her younger sister. Dark eyes, a tangle of sleep hair, and the expression she always wore when she'd been awake long enough to be hungry. "There's a dog," Ruby observed. "There is," Zoe agreed. "He's staying in here for now. Go inside. I'll make breakfast." She settled Ruby at the kitchen table with oatmeal and a stack of DVDs, then slipped back to the garage to check Talon's dressings. His temperature was acceptable. The wound was clean. She fed him the contents of a can of beef stew from the back of the cupboard, which he ate with the focused efficiency of an animal that understood nutrition as a tactical necessity. Then she opened her laptop and typed the K9 designation into the search bar. Nothing useful. She tried descriptions of the vest specifications. She tried RCMP Special Operations K9 units. She tried CSOR K9 assets and classified working dog programs. Nothing that matched the gear she'd pulled off that dog. The equipment was beyond specialized, the kind that didn't appear on any public procurement record. Then the internet dropped. She looked at the router. The light that was always green had gone red. She picked up her phone. No bars. Not one. She walked to the kitchen window, held it above her head, moved to 3 different rooms. Nothing. She had 2 bars minimum in this house. Even in January blizzards, Even when the snow was stacked to the windowsills, she had at least 2 bars. A cold, heavy feeling settled into her chest. She stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, looking out at the cleared driveway and the wall of spruce trees beyond it. The forest was too quiet. Even in winter there were ravens. There were always ravens. Not today. She was reaching for her coat when Talon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was not the same dog from the night before. The exhaustion was still in the set of his body, the careful way he compensated for the wounded side. But his eyes were different, alert in a way that wasn't calm. That was something sharper and older than calm. His hackles had risen in a rigid line from his shoulders to the base of his tail. His lips weren't drawn back. He made no sound at all. He was simply looking at the back wall of the kitchen, the wall that faced the tree line, and everything about him said, "There." Zoe's hand closed around the doorframe. She crossed to the kitchen window and looked out through the frost-edged glass. The forest edge was 40 meters from the back of the house, birch trunks pale and vertical in the morning light. She scanned left to right, looking for movement, for color, for anything that didn't belong. She found them. 3 figures, full tactical kit, dark gray, non-reflective, designed to absorb light rather than scatter it, moving in a controlled wedge formation through the tree line, closing the distance to the house in silence. One carried a compact suppressed rifle. The second had a sidearm drawn. The third was directing the others with hand signals Zoe didn't recognize, but didn't need to. He was sending them to the corners of the property. These were not conservation officers. These were not RCMP in cold weather gear. The discipline, the formation, the absolute absence of any identifying markings on their clothing. These were private contractors, professional ones. And Ruby was in the living room watching a movie, separated from those 3 people by 12 meters of open yard and a hollow core door. The fear hit her like the cold had hit her on the highway, all at once, everywhere, unavoidable. And then it passed through her and came out the other side as something cleaner. Something that didn't shake. She went to the gun cabinet. She loaded the rifle and clipped 4 additional shells to the fabric sling. She looked at Talon. He had not moved from the kitchen doorway, but he was watching her now, the gold eyes tracking her preparation the way they had tracked her hands during the surgery. Precise, attentive, anticipating. "We need to get to the garage," she said quietly. She'd spent every summer of her childhood on this property. She knew where the sight lines fell, where the tree coverage began, which corners of the outbuildings were blind to anyone moving along the tree line. There was a crawlspace entry to the garage workshop that ran beneath the back porch overhang, a low hatch her grandmother had used to access the pipes in winter. It faced away from the approaching operators. It was the only blind spot she had. She took Ruby by the hand first and told her a quiet version of the truth. They were going to play a hiding game. There were some people outside looking for something, and she didn't want them to know they were home. Ruby absorbed this with the wide-eyed seriousness of a child who had spent enough time around Zoe to know her sister, didn't lie to her, and didn't alarm easily. Like hide and seek. Exactly like hide and seek, except we're very, very good at it. She put Ruby in the root cellar under the stairs with a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and the iPad loaded with downloaded episodes of her favorite show. She locked the door from the outside, pocketed the key, and went back for Talon. They moved through the back porch on hands and knees, Zoe with the rifle held low and Talon pressing his body against her left side, belly to the floorboards. His movement so controlled it, barely stirred the dust. The hatch opened onto frozen ground and the shadow of the overhang. They slid out into the hard air and moved along the garage wall in the strip of dead ground between the building and the creek bank. They were 15 meters from the side door when Talon stopped. Not slowed, stopped, every muscle braced, his nose tipped upward and slightly left. Zoe went still. She heard it a second later, the faint compression of snow under a boot, very close. 11-12 meters to their left, behind the rusted chest freezer her grandmother had stored garden tools in. A shape materialized out of the grey shadows between the garage wall and the woodpile. An operator in full kit, scanning right to left with a suppressed pistol, close enough that Zoe could see the condensation of his breath in short, measured clouds. He hadn't seen them. His sweep was going past. Another second, and it would fall directly on the space where she was crouching against the garage wall. She didn't have the runway to raise the rifle. The shot would echo across the entire property and bring the other two at a dead run. She had no good options. Talon made the decision for her. He moved without a sound. 85 pounds of Belgian Malinois crossed the gap in the time it took Zoe to inhale. 3 bounds, each one silent on the packed snow, and hit the operator square in the chest before the man had finished his sweep. The operator went down backwards with nothing more than a muffled grunt, the pistol driven into the snowbank by the impact. Talon's jaws closed on the man's forearm with the controlled precision of a dog who knew exactly how hard to bite and exactly where. Zoe covered the distance in 4 strides, reversed the rifle, and brought the stock down on the side of the man's helmet. Hard, the sound was solid and final. He went still. Talon released immediately and sat back, breathing heavily, his eyes on Zoe. "Good boy," she breathed. Her hands were shaking. She bent and stripped the radio from the man's harness, clipping it to her own belt. No unit patches, no flag, no identification of any kind on his person. She was 3 steps from the garage side door when the radio crackled. "Viper 3, confirm position. Did you sweep the outbuilding?" A flat, controlled voice. Command voice. She turned the volume to its lowest setting, pressed against the wall, and listened. "All units, breaching primary structure in 90 seconds. We need the vest. Confirm retrieval of the T4 module before extraction." The T4 module, the sealed panel in the vest's breast lining, the thing she'd noticed and not opened. She got into the garage through the side door and shoved the bolt home. Talon moved immediately to the center of the space, turned his back on her, and faced the main door, the same posture he'd held through the night. She crossed to the workbench. The vest was where she'd left it. She ran her fingers along the breast lining and found the panel, a flat, waterproof zipper no more than 8 centimeters wide. She opened it. Inside was a ruggedized USB drive encased in hard rubber, smaller than her thumb, unmarked except for a strip of evidence tape with a handwritten notation. "Ski mask saw, geezed copy." She didn't have time to process what that meant. She heard the front door of the house give way. Not a knock, not a call, a single controlled application of force and the sound of the frame splintering. Boots on hardwood. The systematic pattern of a team clearing rooms. They were thorough and they were fast, and Ruby was in the root cellar 2 walls away. Zoe wrapped the drive in her fist, pressed herself against the garage wall, and took a breath deep enough to hurt. Then she did the only thing a paramedic with a rifle and a Belgian Malinois could do. She made noise. She racked the rifle. The sound carried through the garage wall and into the frozen air. Movement in the house stopped. "Whoever is in the outbuilding," said the same flat command voice. "Closer now, just outside the main garage door. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." "You're on private property," Zoe said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "You destroyed my front door. Try the garage door and I'll put a round through it." A pause, the voice recalculated. "Mrs. Tanner." A different register now, smooth, almost reasonable. "My name is Garrison Cray. I represent a private security and intelligence firm operating under a classified federal mandate. The item you're holding is government property. The K9 is a liability. Hand over the vest and the drive, and this ends right now. You and your sister walk away." He knew about Ruby. The cold settled deeper. "The vest is gone," she said. "I disposed of it." "That's unfortunate," Cray said, without missing a beat, "because we both know you didn't. You're a paramedic. You had to see what was in it. So where's the drive, Miss Tanner?" Talon's growl, when it came, was low enough that she felt it through the concrete floor. He knew that voice. The sound coming out of him was not the measured alertness she'd seen all morning. This was something older, the part of an animal that doesn't forget faces, or smells, or the last moment it saw the person it trusted most. "You killed his handler," Zoe said. Silence. "Corporal Marsh suffered an accident during a training exercise," Cray said. "The K9 panicked and ran. We are simply recovering government assets before." "Don't." She kept the rifle on the door. "Don't explain it to me like I'm going to believe it." A brief flat silence, then quietly, "Take them." The main door shuddered as the locking bar gave. Two operators pushed through, sweeping the corners with compact rifles, laser sights drawing red lines through the dim space. Talon launched himself sideways, not at them but in front of her, planting himself between the rifles and the woman who had stitched him closed 14 hours ago. Zoe leveled the rifle. "I have a clear shot on both of you. Set them down." Neither operator moved, but neither fired. Then the sound came. It started as a vibration in the walls, a rhythmic percussion building from the north, crossing the frozen lake and hitting the property like a wave of pressure. Rotor blades, more than one aircraft. The garage windows began to shudder in their frames. The overhead fluorescent swung on its chain, and the sound became a roar that Zoe felt in her sternum. The radio on her belt erupted with panicked crosstalk. "Cray, we have inbound, multiple rotary wing. They are not ours. Repeat, they are not." 3 sets of blinding searchlights hit the garage windows simultaneously. The outside of the building went white. A voice cut through everything, amplified across a megaphone from the air. "This is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. All personnel on the ground, drop weapons, and move to an open area with hands visible. This property is surrounded. You will not receive a second instruction." The two operators looked at each other. They looked at the door, at the light flooding under it, at the count of at least 3 helicopters' worth of rotors, shaking the walls. They set their rifles on the concrete. Talon did not stand down. The garage door came open from the outside, fast, and Garrison Cray came through it backwards, 2 RCMP officers pulling him through. And as he crossed the threshold, he twisted, wrenched one arm free, and raised a sidearm in the direction of the one witness who had cost him everything. Talon was in the air before the weapon was level. He hit Cray from the left side, the impact rotating the man's shoulder away from the shot, the pistol discharging into the garage ceiling and raining insulation down across the floor. Cray crashed against the doorframe. 3 officers were on him. In the next 4 seconds, the pistol stripped from his hand, his wrists cuffed behind him while he was still trying to understand what had happened to him. Talon backed off the moment the officers spoke the command he recognized. He returned to Zoe's side and pressed his flank against her leg. The suture line on his right side had pulled and was seeping again. She put her hand on his back and felt him breathe. A woman in an RCMP windbreaker stepped through the crowd, badge out, dark hair tucked under her watch cap. She looked at the rifle in Zoe's hands, then at the dog, then at the drive Zoe was still holding in her closed fist. "Staff Sergeant Lucinda Fournier," she said. "Miss Tanner, are you injured?" "No." Zoe's legs had begun to shake now, very quietly, like the last vibration after an earthquake. "My sister is in the root cellar. The door is locked from the outside." "My people are with her now." Fournier glanced at Talon. "Stand down, bud, stand down." Her voice shifted into something practiced and gentle, the cadence you used with working dogs you knew. Talon's hackles settled. He let out a long, tired sound through his nose. Zoe lowered herself against the workbench. Ruby appeared in the garage doorway 40 seconds later, still holding the iPad, flanked by 2 officers, looking around at the scene with the wide-awake eyes of a child, sorting out something far beyond the ordinary. "Zoe," she said, "there are helicopters." "I know." "Is the dog okay?" "He's okay." Ruby studied Talon for a moment, then crossed the floor and sat down on the concrete beside her sister and put her head against Zoe's arm without saying anything else. Talon put his chin on Ruby's knee. The 3 of them sat like that while the RCMP finished securing Garrison Cray and his contractors, and the searchlights panned slowly across the yard, and the snow disturbed by the rotors began to settle back to earth in soft, unhurried curtains. Staff Sergeant Fournier explained it to Zoe over coffee in the kitchen, 2 hours later, while Ruby slept on the couch under 3 blankets. The drive in the vest's breast panel belonged to Corporal Calvin Marsh, a Canadian Special Operations Forces soldier embedded on a joint CMP-CSIS counterintelligence operation. Marsh had spent 14 months building a case against Garrison Cray's firm, which had been running illegal domestic surveillance operations and selling the collected intelligence to a foreign state broker. When Marsh's cover was compromised, Cray had ordered him killed and dispatched his team to recover the only copy of the evidence before it could reach anyone who could act on it. Talon had been Marsh's assigned K9 for 3 years. When the operation went wrong in the bush south of Kenora, Talon had run, taking a rifle round in the flank in the seconds before Marsh himself was taken down. He'd covered 8 kilometers through a March blizzard with a classified data module in his vest, and he'd collapsed on a trans-Canada highway where a paramedic happened to be driving home at precisely the right moment. "The tracker you disabled," Fournier said. "That bought us critical time. Cray's team couldn't pinpoint the exact location. By the time they triangulated through the cell jamming equipment, we had a surveillance drone on their encrypted signal and an arrest warrant already signed." Zoe turned her mug in her hands. "What happens to Talon?" Fournier looked at the garage door, where Talon was lying against the threshold, his injured side carefully elevated on a folded blanket, watching the kitchen with half-lidded eyes. She was quiet for a moment. "His record is an exceptional one, but after a handler loss and a combat injury of this severity, a return to operations isn't realistic." She set down her own mug. "A working dog with his conditioning needs land and quiet, and someone who can manage him. Someone who doesn't rattle easily." She didn't add anything else. She didn't need to. Zoe looked at Talon. He raised his head and looked back at her, those pale gold eyes unhurried and steady, as though the question of where he would spend the rest of his life had never really been in doubt. "I've got 300 acres, Zoe said, "and I've decided I'm not selling." From the living room, Ruby stirred on the couch, the small, familiar sounds of her waking up. A sleepy sigh, the shuffle of blankets, then, "Zoe, can the dog come in here?" Talon's tail moved once against the concrete floor, a single, deliberate thump. Zoe stood up, picked up her coffee, and walked toward the living room. "Yeah," she called back. "He can go wherever he wants."